They carried her out as if she were a piece of furniture that had outlived its use. The crowd parted with a stunned silence that felt louder than any insult. Cameras flashed. A woman in a silver gown laughed like crystal. On her throat sat an emerald necklace that had belonged to Simone's grandmother, Estelle, its green fire catching the chandelier light as if the jewel itself were complicit in the moment. Simone's hands closed around the leather, the strap of her grandmother's journal digging into her palm. The pages she had never opened shuffled against the bone of her wrist. Someone hissed, "Smile for the cameras, darling," and the woman wearing Estelle's heirloom did, smiling widely while the gala's orchestra tried to keep playing. Darnell stood a step away from the scene, face composed, the temperature in his eyes colder than the marble beneath their feet. He did not move to stop her. He lifted his chin, and by the lift of a lip she knew the sentence before it left his mouth. "This is over," he said. "You don't belong here anymore." The words were not only a dismissal, they were a verdict, an execution of all the small cruelties that had been building beneath sparring smiles and late-night phone calls, the disappearance of tenderness, the rearrangement of their bed into a guest room, the whispered positioning of the mistress into their shared life like furniture brought home without permission. And later, like final proof, a letter would arrive, stamped, formal, a foreclosure notice bearing the crest of Whitmore Trust Bank and the signature of a trustee. The woman who had worn the emerald would move into the house that Simone and Darnell had called home for 7 years. They did it with efficiency. They did it with a business-like cruelty that hurt more than the laughter. Darnell signed papers one night after dinner, telling Simone the details in the same calm voice he'd once used to propose. He insisted it was normal. He told her not to make scenes. When she protested, he reclassified her anger as hysteria. When she begged him to reconsider, he answered with a text, "My life, my choice." A lawyer's envelope arrived at their townhome the following week. Then a sheriff's deputy, polite but immovable, brought a sheet of paper and a polite warning about personal property. Their keys were collected. The mistress, Rochelle, who everyone called Rella, moved in before Simone could collect the photograph frames that held the faces of the life she'd thought was hers. After the gala, Simone left like a ghost. She could have gone to her sister, to an aunt, to anyone in the small Georgia town where Estelle had raised her with hands that smelled of lemon oil and peppermint soap. But the one thing Simone dragged with her, the one thing she could not set down even if she wanted to, was the journal. Estelle had pressed it into her hands the day they'd moved Simone into a little studio above a bakery. "If you ever feel lost, read this," Estelle had said, voice small and certain. "These are the years when I was saving you for something you don't know yet." Simone tucked the leather under her arm as though it were the last warmth of a body. She slept in a motel room off the interstate that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. Outside, the highway hummed like a constant question. Inside the thin walls, she lay awake and listened to her own breath, the relentless tick of a clock that did not care who had been stripped of a name or of a home. Friends offered platitudes, social feeds filled with pictures, Darnell and Rel laughing at brunch, the emerald necklace in a new light, the house with curtains drawn but shoulders visible behind the glass. The world is efficient at moving on. And the smallness of Simone's phone screen made the movement seem sharper, as though she were watching the demolition of her life in high definition. If this grabbed you, like for more powerful true-feel stories. The journal was no more than a palm-sized book, its leather soft from hands older than Simone's own. Estelle's handwriting was careful, like a gardener planting seeds with intention. Pages were dated, each year addressed as a letter to the girl she'd loved and taught to mend hemmed socks, to make cornbread, to speak kindly to market vendors. There were recipes, of course. There were prayers, too, short lines about gratitude and stubbornness, tiny declarations of faith that did not promise wealth but promised a posture. Stand steady. Simone had kept the book on a top shelf where it would not wrinkle. She had not opened the book because to open it was to open doors to a past she was only just beginning to suspect had rooms she could not enter. She had lived her adult life in tentative steps, never imagining that there existed a corridor in her history filled with doors labeled with a name that sounded both foreign and right. Whitmore. This first opening was clumsy, The motel lamp was the kind that threw a blue-white glare and made every shadow sharp. Simone sat on the edge of the bed. The wedding ring, now an anchor of shame, had already been taken by the custody of an angry man. She slid the journal from under her arm. The smell of old paper and lemon oil rose up like a memory. "To my girl," the first line read, "if you have found this, it means the hour I feared has not yet taken you. Sit with your tea, and let me tell you about what they could never take." There were letters within letters. Estelle had kept copies of notes she'd claimed from a man named Theodore Whitmore. Theodore's name appeared like a comet crossing the page, rare, brilliant, inexplicable. There were names of law firms, of trusts, lines that mentioned custodial safekeeping, and, most startling of all, a page sewn into the back with a heavy, authoritative letter headed with the seal of Whitmore Trust Bank. At first, Simone thought the paper was a forgery, an ending stitched to a life to make a story tidy. But the letter was signed, not in a flowery script but with an economy of marks that looked like power. Theodore Whitmore. "To my daughter, when the world proves unkind," the letter began. It spoke of mistakes, of protective strategies, of a father who had arranged a life for a child he could not immediately claim in the face of enemies and business storms. "You are the beneficiary of certain custodial assets," the letter read, language both legal and intimate. "This arrangement shall remain quiet for your protection until you are ready, or until peril makes silence dangerous." The words were not the warm embrace Simone had dreamed of all her life. They were legal terrain, dotted with sealed phrases that promised control over things she had never touched. There was a note from a trustee, a name and a number scribbled in the margins. Whitmore Trust Bank Trust Services, @Tn H. Greer. There was also a page, brittle at the fold, that named an entity, Whitmore Trust Bank Holding, and a phrase that struck her like ice. Controlling interest held in trust for beneficiary, to be claimed upon written petition and substantiation of identity. Simone read the letter 3 times. It reoriented whatever map she had been following. A bank was an institution of cold decisions and ink, but in these lines it had become potential shelter. It had the power to stop the paper that had come to her door the previous week. It had the power to say the foreclosure could not, in fact, proceed. She put the journal down and let her head fall into her hands. The motel room was a space where thoughts expanded and then shrank again. She could imagine, in vivid flashes, the scene at the gala, the emerald necklace, the raised chin, the crowd's hush. Then imagine in a different light a counterscene. A boardroom with heavy oak chairs with a man whose hand could not be easily brushed aside. In one life she was on the outside. In another, the definition of outside could be redefined by the signatures of people like Theodore Whitmore. Her fingers shook as she dialed. The number on the margin belonged to a trust services desk she imagined would be full of men like the trustee who had served Darnell's papers. Polite, grave, certain. The line connected to a voice that said, "Whitmore Trust Bank. This is Hester Greer." Hester Greer listened. She did not phrase answers as kindness. She had the efficiency of someone who had hungered for decades for the clarity that paperwork brings. "We have a sealed trust," Simone said, the letters of Whitmore clumsy and foreign in her mouth. Hester asked her for details, a date of birth, a mother's maiden name. Simone recited like someone reading from a life she had carried in her throat. "There is a process," Hester said. "There are verifications. This is not the kind of file you open on a whim." The phone turned the phrase into a fact. "If you are a beneficiary, Ms. Dubois, there are steps." Simone closed her eyes. The journal lay open on the motel bedspread like a small altar. There was a plan here, but it was not a miraculous instant. It would take signatures, corroboration, pieces of identity. It would take a courage she had not yet mined. It would require her to become a woman who could ask for what rightfully belonged to her without begging. She did not yet know how to become that woman. In the days after, as she gathered the few boxes of what she could claim from the house, 2 framed photos, a chipped teacup Estelle had always said was good for warming the hands, a sweater that still smelled faintly of her grandmother's rosewater. Social media did not relent. Accounts that had once liked Darnell's posts now took positions as judges. Old friends withdrew. Loretta, Kenneth, and Vanessa, members of the curated family Darnell had married into, performed the ritual of ostracism with surgical efficiency. They seemed to exist on the currency of status, their dismay a carefully sculpted thing, their pity a display. But there was another current running through the pain. A woman from Simone's church, someone who had watched her grow up, left a voicemail. Marcus, a friend who had once brought her soup when she had been ill, texted a message that said, "Meet me at the diner. You don't have to do this alone." Marcus's messages were small constellations. A call at noon, a bag of clothes arranged on the motel bed, an old sweater he had found and pushed into her hands like a lifeline. His kindness was a different kind of currency, one that did not clink or count but warmed. Despite offers of help, Simone found herself compelled to do something none of them had expected. She returned to the house one last time. It was dusk, and the winter air had the bite of truth. The gate was open. Rella's car sat like a foreign object in the driveway, a sleek swallow of metal. The door was unlocked. Inside the living room, the emerald rested on a velvet pillow, flanked by roses that had no business being indoors at that hour. Rella had arranged the place with the same instinct that had allowed her to take Simone's jewelry. She filled the house with borrowed legibility. The place smelled of a perfume Simone couldn't name, and the air felt like a theater before the curtain rose. On the mantel, something else caught Simone's eye. A photograph left face down, its frame askew. She straightened it. The picture was of Darnell and Rel at some event months ago, a sun-struck snapshot. Behind them, in the blurred background, a man stood, older, with a bearing she did not recognize until she looked for the angle of his jaw. It was a face like a lock you think you can't open until you find the key. Theodore Whitmore's presence at the edge of that photograph shifted the geometry of things. He had been closer to them in the social world than she'd ever imagined. Or perhaps he had been waiting at the perimeter, watching the math of two lives come undone. The foreclosure notice lay in a bowl by the door like a clean white accusation. Simone had expected to find it a ruin. Instead, she felt a curious peace. It was in that pocket of quiet that she finally returned to the journal and read until the words blurred. Estelle's years of careful memory had become a bridge. Estelle had written about a man who had loved in his way, blunt, strategic, sometimes absent. She had written about decisions made in rooms where safety was the first currency. "I asked him to keep her safe," Estelle had written of Theodore, in a paragraph that was short enough that its restraint felt like a knife. Not for his pride, for her life. The language was layered. Gratitude, complaint, surrender. There were sketches of conversations, lines about lawyers and trustees, mentions of payments into a holding entity that, over the years, accumulated enough of a margin to tip into control. As Simone traced the ink, a picture formed. A father who, by arrangement, by cold, deliberate planning, had ensured that if danger ever found his daughter, there would be a lever somewhere in the system she could pull. It felt both like the last service a man could render and a confession of fear. He had placed her within the architecture of money not as a reward, but as armor. Armor, however, does not automatically fit. It has to be wielded. It has to be claimed. The bank's name swelled on the page until it was a drumbeat. Whitmore Trust Bank. It was, the note suggested, more than a metaphor. The bank held in trust, controlling shares of an entity that could do the precise thing Simone needed. That is, hold the authority to halt transactions, to silence the mechanical cruelty of foreclosure with a simple administrative letter. There were caveats. The trust required proof. The board required a meeting. Trustees moved slowly. But ink on paper also meant that decisions could be called into being. Someone could exercise control. Someone could stop the eviction. Simone spent that night making lists. She cataloged what she had lost and what remained. She cataloged the names in the journal. She cataloged the faces in the photograph and the offices mentioned in the margins. She made a small, irrational, fierce promise to herself. She would not allow her life to be rearranged by a man's betrayal without answering back with the same tool he had thought to use. Structure. She was not thinking yet of spectacle. She was thinking in smaller measures, of headquarters, of papers, of proof. She thought of the sheriff who had delivered the eviction notice and wondered if the sheriff would take orders from the bank, if the bank said the order had been misapplied. But developing a strategy felt like stepping into a room full of adult voices she had not yet learned to command. It felt necessary. Theodore Whitmore, of his own part, had lived a life measured by the exactness of paper and the geometry of influence. He had made calculations and placed protections in place. He had a public life that valued discretion. He had, as the journal's margins hinted, reasons for keeping his involvement shadowed. He was not by any stretch the sort of man to respond to street justice. He had, instead, the vocabulary of trustees, of boards and letters and seals. To reach him would require formalities. To meet him would require proof and nerve. Simone understood both demands. She also understood that to re-enter a world where powerful men decided the fate of others, she would have to adopt the language of power without becoming unrecognizable to her own moral center. She called Marcus the next morning. He arrived at the diner with 2 coffees and an old envelope. "I found this at your house under a bookshelf," he said. Inside the envelope were scattered receipts and a business card with the embossed name of a law office. "You deserve more than a text," Marcus said, and placed a hand over hers. He listened while Simone spoke, not with the quiet shock the others had offered, but with a deliberate attention that made her feel less like glass. "You have a bank named in a journal," he said finally. "You have a trustee number. You have a photograph with Theodore. That is a lot." He did not say miracle or instant fix. He did not say, "This will make everything right." He offered instead the practical kindness of someone who had read the wrongs and refused to let them stand alone. "We'll go to this Hester Greer," he said. "We'll start the paperwork. We'll make them look up." There was, Simone realized, a growing muscle she had not yet flexed, the muscle of insisting on oneself. For years she had been polite, deflecting attention, letting grievances simmer. Now there was a clarity like frost. It sharpened the edges of her will. She had not been born into the world of wealth, but neither had she been born into a life devoid of agency. Estelle had taught her to fix shoes, to bake bread, to sit with people who were grieving, and to offer the smallest consolation, a warm hand. Those skills felt suddenly like training for leadership. There is a way to take steadiness from the ordinary and make it authoritative. Simone went to the bank's address written in the journal, an office in a building with an understated stone face on the east side of the city. She wore the sweater Marcus had brought, and her grandmother's scarf at her throat like a secret. The lobby smelled of polished wood and the faint antiseptic aroma of someone who prized tidiness. A woman at the reception desk, while not uncaring, had the professional indifference of someone paid to manage a rival. "Whitmore Trust Bank," she said, voice perfectly flat. "Do you have an appointment?" Simone showed the journal, a fragment of a signature, a photograph. She explained in plain language. The woman took the journal into a back office as though it were evidence in a case. The minutes between the reception and the return were an hour made into paper, the hush of a room where people read other people's lives for a living. When Hester Greer returned, she wore a jacket that matched the severity of her voice. She had looked through the journal and made a small, almost imperceptible folding of the lips. "We have received similar inquiries before," she said. "They always require verification, identity, a meeting with counsel. A meeting." Simone felt the air leave her body. For a second she feared the apparatus of power would respond with an impenetrable wall. But Hester's eyes softened as she held the journal. "Your grandmother kept careful notes," she said. "There is a file attached. If the beneficiary presents herself and we verify lineage, we will act in the interest of the trust." The words were not an immediate armistice. They were not even a promise. But they were a seam. They were an opening. Simone left the bank with the journal in her bag and a card that said, in bureaucratic font, "Trust Verification Office, Whitmore Trust Bank." She had a path forward, however long and winding it might be. Back at the motel, she opened the journal to the last letter Estelle had written. "If you use what you are given to wound," Estelle wrote, "then you are no better than the wounder. If you use your power to lift others, then all the harm will have a light through it." The lines were small, like a prayer stitched into a sweater. Simone read them until they were a kind of steady heartbeat. She had power placed into her hands like a dangerous tool. She could, if she chose, wield it to reverse the humiliation. She could also use it to prevent others from becoming what had happened to her. That night, she dreamed that she walked into the house and did not find Raleigh on the sofa, but instead saw a row of women, some with suitcases, some with children, sitting on the living room floor like a quiet invasion of dignity. They looked up at her and smiled with the slack of people who had been given a second chance at breakfast. She woke with the image in her throat like scripture. But reality was a series of smaller, sharper things. The foreclosure notice still had at its edge the name of her husband as authorizer. The house keys had been given to Rella. There was a threat of legal motion if she contested. Each piece was a gear in a machine Darnell had set in motion. And yet now, in the margin of a leather-bound book, perched the notion of leverage. The trust mechanisms existed. They were not myth. There was danger in claiming power too soon. Bank boards had the patience of glaciers. Trustees preferred certainty to drama. The journal's instructions were precise. They asked for substantiation and calm. To charge into a gala with accusations would be to make herself appear unstable, the very image Darnell had cultivated to discredit her. So Simone did not rush to spectacle. She began a quieter work. She collected the documents she could, the copies of bills, the dates of Darnell's absences, photographs of the nights when Raleigh's car arrived early, screenshots of messages. She reached out, in small ways, to a kind of legal aid that did not give instructions but would accept a client and discuss rights. She strengthened her circle. Marcus, a pastor who had known Estelle, a woman from church who had once worked in trust services and who offered to accompany Simone to the trustee meeting. At the same time, Darnell's life continued to bloom in the press. He gave an interview to a glossy magazine in which he spoke of new beginnings and of the difficult necessity of a fresh start. The words were smooth. He had traded the messy intimacy of a marriage for the curated intimacy of a public story. He had also, in the process of constructing his new life, authorized a foreclosure on the home they had shared. The law had recorded his signature. The bank had issued the paperwork. The sheriff had read the piece of paper that made Simone's heartbeat quadruple. She was, for the first time in months, angry in a way that was not brittle. It was a slow, purposeful anger that felt like a hand preparing to lift a weight. It was not revenge. She did not think of breaking Darnell's career. She thought of righting an injustice and of preventing another woman from being reduced to the same humiliating shape. Somewhere in the marrow of the plan was not the smell of vengeance but the taste of reparation. News of a foreclosure travels differently in small towns and in large cities. In the small place where Estelle had once kept a garden of tomatoes, the story was a whispered tragedy. In the city it was a line item, a social media skirmish, a point of gossip that fell away. But everywhere, in the soft corners where humans live, a home losing its hold on a family is a violence that all but begs repair. Simone filed papers of identity at the bank. She met briefly with counsel. She practiced a calm voice, the kind that people listen to when they believe the speaker has nothing to prove, but everything to lose. She began, as Estelle had taught, to stitch small kindnesses in the world that had been cruel to her. She volunteered at a shelter once, folding donated shirts with the same care Estelle had taught her, and watched as faces lit up at the offer of a warm meal. The work steadied her. One afternoon, while she sat in the small library of the motel reading yet another letter from the journal, a car pulled up with tinted windows and the discreet gait of someone who belonged in a building with heavy curtains. A man stepped out, neither ostentatious nor cold, simply a man whose presence claimed a room like a bookmark. He was accompanied by a young woman who introduced herself as Theodore Whitmore's personal aide. "Mr. Whitmore would like to meet with you," she said. The words hung in the air like a bell. For a suspended second, Simone thought it impossible to breathe. Theodore did not ask to take control. He came as a question, not a solution. He sat across from her with the patience of someone who had practiced listening. His face was lined, but his eyes were clear. He did not begin with apologies. Instead, he began with the fact that had always been present behind the paperwork. He had placed assets in trust out of a fear that some very public danger might reach a young woman he kept like an image in his pocket. "I did what I thought was right," he said. "I did not ask you. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." Simone let the journal sit between them like a ledger. The air in the room thrummed with consequences. There is an awkward etiquette in reconciling with a man whose absence has shaped your whole life. Simone could have thrown the book at him, could have demanded explanations until he grew shamefully small. Instead, she folded the leather closed and placed it on her knees. She felt the weight of represented years. "You have a bank," she said. The statement was not a question but a tether. "You have a clause that might stop them from taking the house." Theodore's face altered by a fraction. "There are protocols," he said. "We don't act on hearsay. There must be verification. There must be counsel involved. But I will not stand by while the machinery of social cruelty grinds someone I care about." He was careful with his power. That carefulness both comforted and infuriated Simone. It said much about the kind of man he was: prudent, deliberative, and slow to public shows. Yet it also meant she would have to work within his tempo. For now, he offered a small, solid thing: a meeting with Hester Greer and a commitment to convene the Trusts Committee if the evidence supported her claim. He did not promise a dramatic halt to the foreclosure, but he did promise that the bank would not be blind, and that there were doors in its system someone with knowledge could open. Simone left the meeting with a meeting time and a new kind of gravity in her chest. The path ahead required courage, paperwork, patience, and the ability to speak the language of trustees without losing the tenderness that had been trained into her by a grandmother who mended socks. It would take days and weeks. It would require Marcus's steady presence, the pastor's good counsel, the bank's slow machinery. It would require her to stand publicly and be believed. That night she dreamt of the gala again, of the emerald necklace and the laughter. But the dream shifted like a film reel. In it, the necklace was not a prize, it was a key. In the film, Simone pressed it into the hands of a woman whose face she did not know, a survivor of some small, quiet violence, and the woman opened a door in the house that had been taken and led others inside. The dream left her with a warmth that did not erase the sting, but it offered direction. The thing she had been given could be used to widen the circle of safety for people like Estelle's neighbors, people like the women at the shelter. She woke early, journal on the bedside, and began to make lists again. Contacts, documents, dates. She had the trustee's card. She had a meeting scheduled. The foreclosure was still an engine running in the background, scheduled to finalize at the end of the week. The trustee would require verification by then. There was no guarantee. But there was, for the first time in many months, a locus of possibility. Outside, the city moved in its habitual rhythm. Inside the motel room, Simone tied Estelle's scarf around her neck and felt, like armor, the past's counsel. She had been dragged out of a life in a suit and a pair of heels, her face in cameras. She had been humiliated in a hall where chandeliers hummed like witnesses. But the humiliation would not be the last chapter. She had a bank's name at the back of a leather book. She had a man who had made a life measured by trusts and could perhaps bend its machinery toward mercy. She had someone who offered a warm hand at a diner booth, and a pastor who lent courage like a coat. And she had the stubborn lesson of a grandmother who had always said, "Worth is not hung on necklaces or names. It is threaded quietly into what you choose to do with what you find." She was not ready to fashion a public spectacle. She was not ready to let the pain crush into bitter triumph. She would take the trust's slow steps, piecing together evidence and language. She would ask for what was hers and what belonged by right to the protection of others. The foreclosure clock ticked. On the day before the trustee meeting, Simone received a notice that made the motel light feel suddenly too thin. The house had been staged for sale. An open house would be held next week. A small paper sign had been posted on the front gate. The mistress had scrubbed the rooms and placed fresh flowers. The world was moving to finalize what Darnell had begun. Simone folded the paper and tucked it into the journal. She called Marcus and left him a message that was not panicked but precise. She took the train to the city, clutching her bag tight enough that her knuckles whitened. The bank's columns rose like a promise. At the door she paused, feeling once more the smallness of being the woman everyone had thought to erase. Then she walked in. In a conference room with glass walls that let in the gray winter sky, Hester Greer and two other men in mild suits sat like judges. Theodore Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his posture measured. Simone placed the journal before them. Papers were signed, questions were asked. Her birth certificate, her grandmother's sworn affidavit, and a line of correspondence that bore Theodore's discreet signature were considered and noted. Hester's pen scratched across a ledger. It won't be immediate, Hester warned. Board protocol demands a vote. Trustees cannot act on emotion, but there is a provision. She tapped the ledger. We have temporary power to issue a stay on any foreclosure once the committee is convened and evidence is presented. We can petition the trustee with a motion to stay. We can ask for an audit of the trustee's actions in this matter. Simone's breath hitched, not because the bank had moved, but because she saw at last the possibility of interrupting the machinery that had taken her home. It was not drama. It was paper. But in paper, so many lives find shelter. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, the conference room air felt like prayer, not loud but urgent. Theodore's face, as he looked at her, was a plain map of regret and resolve. You must choose how you will use whatever authority is accorded, he said quietly. If you want retribution, I will stand aside. If you want restoration, then we will do this carefully, and we will protect the people who need protection. Simone closed her eyes for a second, tasting the line of Estelle's words at the back of the journal. Do not use what you are given to wound. She opened her eyes and felt the muscle of insistence, quiet, firm, set in her jaw. There were, already, plans forming. How to gather the evidence of Rel's pattern, how to tie the foreclosure to a chain of misrepresentations, how to stop the sale while ensuring the house became a place of refuge rather than a revenge tableau. There was also the knowledge that Darnell would not step back quietly. He had shown himself willing to sacrifice a marriage for a mistress, and a man who will betray a spouse for the sake of convenience will not shrink from public explanation when challenged. There would be counterclaims. There would be optics. There would be friends who would prefer to remain neutral than to appear to choose sides. The conference room door opened, and an aide delivered an envelope with a sheriff's seal. It contained notice of the scheduled auction, set for the coming week. The sheriff's letter was procedural and final in a way that bruised the edges of hope. Hester placed it on the table with the rest of the papers. We will call a vote, she said. We will request a stay. We will gather evidence. But the process will not be instantaneous. Simone felt all this like a tide rising against a beach. She had the journal, the trustee's ear, Theodore's attention, Marcus's steadiness. She also had a man who had weaponized the bank's process against her and had no scruple about using the legal instruments at his disposal. She needed to move both with the careful tempo of legal processes and with the urgency of a woman who had been seen on camera while her life was being destroyed. As the meeting adjourned, a young staffer asked if Simone would be willing to come to a closed board meeting to present her case. We will need evidence, Hester said. We will need time to prepare. We will need you to be composed, Ms. Dubois. Composure was an achievement she had not expected to reach so soon. But Simone had a kind of dignity that did not depend on approval. It was not made of the brittle stuff of public favor. It was the quiet, steady thing that Estelle had taught, the habit of making bread and mending tears. She left the bank with a calendar full of appointments and a small, solid feeling that, at last, she could be an actor in the story the men had tried to write without her. Back at the motel, Simone sat at the cheap desk and opened the journal one more time. The last pages were Estelle's simplest. Be a shelter, she had written. If you cannot keep all of your things, keep what matters. Keep your courage. Keep your hands. Keep your heart. She placed the journal on the bed and lay back. There was fatigue in her bones, but not the kind that broke. It was the weight of a long night of standing and then choosing to stand again. The foreclosure notice tucked into the journal was a small white thing like a scar. The bank had given her a path. Theodore had given her a place to begin. Marcus had given her steady companionship. Estelle had given her the moral compass that would not let her use the bank's power as a cudgel. There would be a board vote. There would be hearings. There would be a public that would want spectacle. There would be nights when the fear crawled under her skin and wanted to make her small again. But she had the journal and the bank, and the trust of a man who had at last reached across a gulf with both caution and sincerity. She closed the motel room's cheap curtains against the winter dusk and imagined, not a party where she would command revenge, but a home that could become a safe place for someone else. She imagined women sitting in the living room folding shirts into neat stacks, children learning to bake bread in a kitchen that had once been witness to the kind of humiliation that corrodes. She imagined a foundation, but she did not yet name it. For now there was only the next step, the board meeting and the gathering of proof. The night deepened. The city hummed on. Simone placed Estelle's journal on the bedside table and breathed. The foreclosure clock was loud enough to be heard, but within the ledger of paper and signatures there was now a counterweight. There would be time to prepare. There would be time to assemble evidence. When the bank's committee convened, Simone would be ready to speak not as a woman who demanded revenge, but as a woman who demanded dignity for herself, and for those who would follow her. She slept. Not with the lightness of someone who had won, but with the steadiness of someone who had found her starting line. The house was scheduled for auction. The mistress had the keys. The bank's machinery had moved, and Darnell had made his choice. But in the margin of history, in a leather-bound book and in the quiet architecture of trust, a different possibility had been placed into her hands. Morning came as a thin strip of light through the motel window. Simone packed the journal into her bag and checked the calendar one last time. She was heading into a room where powerful people made decisions. She had in her pocket the smallest of all weapons, evidence, and in her heart, the kind of resolve that Estelle had taught, to do good with what you have, never to wound with power that was meant to shelter. She walked out into the half-light of the city, her scarf loose about her throat. The day would demand that she be precise, patient, and unflinching. The foreclosure's gears were loud. Her voice would need to be louder still. The morning light had a new edge to it when Simone left the motel. It cut the city into clean planes, made stone and glass look like pages of an open ledger. She walked with the journal in her bag, and the list of witnesses she had begun to collect, folded into the pocket of her coat. Each name felt like a stitch in something she was finally learning to sew. The property manager who'd seen Rel's duplicate keys, the neighbor who remembered deliveries at odd hours, the housekeeper who had saved a voicemail, the bank clerk who had noticed a last-minute trustee instruction that had felt wrong. The names were small lights. Together, they made a channel. Marcus met her at the bank's side entrance. He had a thermos of coffee and a calm that did not try to erase the weight of the morning. He slid into the passenger seat without ceremony and took her hand for a single, steadying breath. "You look like someone who remembers how to make a plan," he said. His voice was low. "I am learning," Simone answered. For a blink she thought of Estelle's hands, calloused, competent, folding dough into a pan. She felt an odd kinship between that domestic steadiness and the paperwork she now faced. The world had turned her recipes into evidence, her small acts of care into strategy. Inside the bank, the air smelled of polished wood and the faint chemical of paper. The boardroom was quieter now than the storm it was about to meet. Theodore Whitmore sat at the head of the table with Hester Greer on his left and legal counsel on his right. The members of the trust committee were already assembled, people whose lives were spent in the grammar of signatures and seals. They had the lethargic attention of men and women accustomed to time measured in meeting agendas. They listened to Simone with the precise curiosity of a committee about to be asked to bend the rules for the sake of justice. She laid out the evidence in the spare way she had learned to speak. Photograph, voicemail printouts, the property manager's dated statement, screenshots, the sheriff's notice. She did not plead. She presented. Her voice was even. "I am asking you to issue a stay on the foreclosure and to investigate the trustee's authorization," she said. "I am not asking for a spectacle. I am asking for the bank to pause a process that has been used to dispossess me based on false pretenses." Hester's pen moved slowly across her notepad. Theodore watched Simone with that careful look, like someone reading a sentence for the weight of the commas. When the room deliberated, it did so in terminology Simone could not pretend to love. It did so, however, with a surprising speed. The presence of a possible fraud, evidence of an individual using forged documents and deceit to obtain property, was the kind of thing trust people were trained to take seriously. The board agreed to convene an emergency meeting. Hester promised an internal audit of the trustees' actions. They would issue a temporary stay while they investigated. She said the words that felt like rain on parched ground. There was no theater to this moment. It was paper turned into shelter, administration doing what it could where the law permitted. A clerk arranged a letter that froze the trustees' authority in the file. A copy went to the sheriff's office. Another went to the county recorder. It was not the slam of a gavel. It was the slow, bureaucratic clench of instruments used correctly. Simone felt relief like a tide. But relief did not mean the end. It was instead the beginning of the part that required patience and vigilance. The board's stay bought time. Evidence still needed to be gathered and presented. The trustees' motives would be examined. There were rhythms here, depositions, interviews, sworn statements, that would not bend to moral impatience. Simone learned to inhabit the space of waiting with a new kind of purpose. She would not be passive in that space. She would make it useful. She spent the next days moving through a flurry of small, exact acts. She met the housekeeper at a diner and listened as the woman, nervously stirring creamer, walked her through dates and deliveries. She sat with the property manager in an office lined with blueprints as he produced a box of spare keys. "This came with a tag that says R. Montgomery," he said. He had not thought the tag suspicious at the time. He had thought it convenient. When she asked him about the day Rel had rearranged the curtains, he remembered the sound of heels on the tile and a laugh that did not belong. A former assistant of Rel's, Claire, who had left the mistress's orbit when the lies grew too heavy, came forward with an envelope of receipts and a series of text messages that showed Rel coaching someone on what to say. Claire's voice shook when she spoke, but her testimony was steady. "She would tell me what to say to people who asked for references. She told me what her name was in public and what it should be on paper." Claire had screenshots that matched the handwriting on forms in the house files. The bank's investigators, once convened, found a pattern. An odd series of trustee instructions executed late at night. A one-off authorization that had moved faster than usual. A signature that could be traced to an intermediary who had since left town. None of this, in isolation, would have made a jury cry. But together, the photographs, the keys, the receipts, the voicemail, the neighbor's memory of strange deliveries, an outline emerged. They had enough, the investigators told Simone, to present a case for wrongdoing. She and Theodore planned their public move carefully. He insisted on restraint. "We will not use what we have to hurt," he said. "We will use it to protect. We will do it so that the truth is clear, and those who have been harmed will not be harmed again." There was a moral clarity to his tone that soothed and annoyed in equal measure. Simone wanted for a beat to go to the microphone and name each person who had made her a spectacle. She wanted to call out Loretta's flinty smile, to mention the precise way Darnell had thrown a napkin at her like an insult disguised as closure. But Estelle's lesson stitched itself into her thoughts like a hem. Do not use what you have to wound. She would not feast on humiliation like a dessert. She would aim for the light that revealed fraud so it could be punished and prevented. The opportunity arrived sooner than she had expected. The Whitmore Foundation planned a winter gala to raise funds for programs that the bank itself had sponsored. The same ornate ballroom where she had been dragged out would host the foundation's donors, the city's elite, and its cameras. Theodore proposed to use the night, carefully and with counsel, as the setting to lay out the evidence. It would be a public forum with the weight of the foundation behind it. He did not wish to make the evening about revenge. He wished to place truth in a space where those who owed reputations would have to face what had been done in their name. Simone wrestled with the idea. The gala was the place she had been humiliated. A return there would feel, to those watching, like theater. But Theodore's plan was not about theater. It was about leverage. This was where the city's attention would be focused. This was where the evidence, displayed with care, would reach those who could act: journalists, police, patrons who had influence. Simone took counsel from Marcus and from her pastor. They reminded her that being visible was not the same as being vindictive. On the night of the gala, the chandeliers burned with a patient, indulgent light. Gold leaf shone, People flowed like river currents in gowns and tuxes. Simone stood at the edge of the room clutching her journal in a clutch of leather gloves like a talisman. She dressed not for spectacle but for control. A dark dress that let her shoulders hold the straight line of her spine. A shawl Estelle had once used as a tablecloth years ago. Marcus waited nearby, his presence a quiet buoy. When Theodore took the stage, the orchestra lowered its strings like a held breath. He introduced the Whitmore Foundation with the gravity of a man who had built institutions to do good. Then he moved the evening's script a hair to the left of where the guests thought it would go. Tonight, he said, we must lift the curtain on actions taken in our community that do not reflect the values we profess. He summoned Hester and the bank's counsel. They presented the investigation's findings on the projection screen with clean, unembellished clarity. Timestamps from security footage, the property manager's sworn statement, Claire's messages, the trustee's irregular instructions. The footage was the single, terrible, infallible witness. Late-night clips showing Rel taking duplicate keys, signing her name with a pen that hesitated, entering rooms she had no legal right to enter. A screenshot showed a document in which a forged signature mirrored Darnell's, and another showed the errant trustee's last-minute authorization. The images did not scream. They rendered. Simone had requested that the police be present as observers, and an officer near the stage rose when charges were formally recommended. The police, having subpoenaed records, confirmed there was probable cause to investigate further. An arrest warrant was issued for Rel on counts that included fraud and impersonation. The room that had once applauded Rel's laughter fell into a hush that was not born of malice, but of comprehension. The guests, standing in their gold-threaded clothing, realized they had been witnesses to a con. Rel's face, pale, mascara-streaked, appeared from a back corridor as the police guided her forward. She looked for a moment, like someone who had finally been asked to account for all the lies she had told. Her eyes flicked to Darnell, who stood with the brittle composure of a man who had decided, in a private life, a cruelty he now had to explain in public. He had chosen another life, but the moral syntax that had guided that choice did not protect him from consequences when his name and signature had been used to strip a woman of her home. The arrest was not a spectacle of shouts and gloating. It was a quiet, judicial thing. Officers with warrants, a woman in handcuffs, a murmuring crowd. Simone watched with a steadiness that surprised her. When her name was murmured, when the flashes of cameras grazed her face like cold rain, she did not look away. She faced what had been done to her and let the truth unmask itself without her hand in the unmaking. Darnell's collapse came in subtler forms. He was asked that night to leave the gala by the foundation's board. His employer, an investment firm that had long enjoyed his smooth presence at corporate events, issued a statement that night, distancing themselves from personal conduct inconsistent with our values. A phrase that meant a lost role, a severed company-funded image. Loretta and the other in-laws retreated like a tide of silk, their disapproval no longer a public posture but a private, expensive convenience. After the guests dispersed, Theodore found Simone near the coat check where the echoes of music lingered like afterthoughts. "You handled it the way Estelle would have wanted," he said. There was no praise in his voice, only recognition. Simone felt the sentence like a balm and an ache at once. Recognition did not undo the nights of tears, it made them less lonely. In the days that followed, the legal machinery turned. Rella was formally charged and held for trial. The trustee who had signed the rushed order faced questions about the chain of custody for documents. The sheriff's office rescinded the eviction notice pending the court's findings. The house, once slated for auction, was removed from the sale list. These were not instant miracles. They were the patient labor of people who had been willing to look at the paper and see what the paper itself had tried to hide. Simone refused invitations to use her sudden visibility as a pulpit for personal testimony. It was not that she lacked words. She had 1,000. It was that she knew viscerally how easily stories become theater for the consumption of strangers. Instead, she made smaller choices. She sat with women at a local shelter and listened. She gave interviews that emphasized systems more than scandal. She used the media attention to find others who had been hurt in quiet ways. Each new narrative she encountered braided with her own. Women who had lost homes to similar schemes, neighbors whose trust had been leached away by people adept at using charm for gain. Theodore did not take control of her narrative. He offered resources, not orders. He set in motion an internal fund at Whitmore Trust Bank, earmarked for survivors of domestic fraud and displacement, a pot of money that would pay for temporary housing, emergency legal fees, and counseling. The bank's board voted to allocate seed funds for what Simone would later name Estelle's Hope. The money was not a reward. It was a tool, and Simone treated it as such. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table of a house she could not yet enter, and wrote lists of programs she wanted to see. An emergency legal fund, job training that taught women to manage finances and spot red flags, a hotline staffed by people who had navigated such storms themselves. When she shared those lists with Theodore, he asked to be included as a partner, not as a patron. "Help me make it accountable," he said. "Help me make it last." Building the foundation was work of a different taste. Administrative, detail-rich, slow. Simone learned to sit in meetings where budgets and bylaws were discussed and to feel, in her bones, that this was a form of ministry. She named the foundation for Estelle because she could not name it for herself. Estelle's Hope would be a place with low thresholds for help, staffed by people who understood the grammar of dignity. Marcus stood by her through this work with the soft loyalty of someone who had chosen presence over pronouncement. They did not rush into romance as compensation for past wounds. Their closeness was incremental. A phone call that came when she was frustrated. A hand offered when she left hearings. A gentle insistence on rest. There were moments when their eyes found each other and a shared laughter rose like sunlight through the blinds. These were the small sacred pieces of life that a life reclaimed often yields. Meanwhile, Darnell found himself facing consequences that were less dramatic than expected, but more devastating in the long view. He was dismissed from his position. Clients withdrew. Friendships thinned into polite distance. He called Simone from an unknown number once, voice raw with a regret that seemed more about his losses than hers. "I thought I was making a new life," he said. "I didn't see where it led." Simone listened and then asked for simple things, a return of certain personal papers, the right to collect a few photographs. She did not want his apologies as liner notes to her recovery. She wanted the small, practical reparations that kept the story from dangling. He complied, as much because of public pressure as private shame. In the end, their separation was a clean, legal thing. He was accountable for what he had signed. The law moved as it was meant to. But Simone's sense of victory did not come from watching a man fall. It came from the knowledge that a system had been halted from being weaponized again, and that resources had been redirected to shelter rather than spectacle. Rel's trial unfolded in the press. It was not a public carnival. It was a proceeding where her fabrications and the evidence of them were examined. She was convicted of charges related to identity fraud and the wrongful acquisition of property documents. The judgment was not what Simone wanted most. She wanted always the securing of the house and the continuity of lives. Still, the courtroom's decision carried weight. It signaled that the city's social currency could not override the law. Simone, for her part, insisted the proceedings remain a matter of record and not revenge. She often thought of Estelle's line, "If you use what you are given to wound, you are no better than the wounder." She had been tempted, certainly. The temptation to humiliate the very people who had humiliated her was a small, venomous thing. But each time she felt that pull, she folded the leather journal closed and listened instead to the quiet voices of the women at the shelter, who said, over time, that Simone's presence had made them feel safer. The house with the wide front porch and the chipped step where Estelle used to sweep, was eventually returned to Simone's name and effect, not simply by the reversal of one signature, but by the bank working with local authorities to ensure the remedy protected the tenants and the community. The trustee who had acted improperly faced censure, and the bank instituted new safeguards for trustee authorizations. These were bureaucratic victories, perhaps, but victories nonetheless. They prevented future injustices from taking the same easy path. When the house keys were finally handed to Simone in a quiet office rather than a flash of cameras, she did not break down in tears. She stood with the journal in one hand and the keys in the other and felt, not triumph but a deep measured gratitude. She had not been saved by a fairy godfather. She had been recognized by a man who admitted to the system's failure and chose to use his influence to correct it. She had built an unlikely coalition, a bank, a pastor, a friend, an ex-housekeeper, a whistleblower, and a grandmother's lifetime of careful notes. That was what had brought her home. One afternoon, months later, Simone opened the front door of the house and breathed the smell of wood warmed by sun. She walked through rooms that bore traces of the past and the careful touch of restoration. She found a place on the porch and sat with the journal on her lap. Estelle had written about the dignity of mending. Simone had learned the dignity of mending systems. The house would become, under the guidance of Estelle's hope, a center for transitional programs, a place where the kitchen would host classes on budgeting and baking, where volunteers would teach sewing and resume writing, where a small legal clinic would sit in a converted study and offer free counsel for a few hours a week. The foundation that bore Estelle's name did not proclaim itself loudly. It began with a few stalwart donors and a handful of volunteers. It grew, not because Simone sought celebrity, but because she practiced what her grandmother had taught: steady, patient, and directed care. When the bank offered to match some of the seed funding for a 2-year program, she insisted on an independent oversight committee. The resources were substantial enough to change lives, but structured to avoid dependency. Simone had little appetite for creating another system where power concentrated without accountability. She wanted to teach people how to recognize the small predators that had once used charm as a tool. As Estelle's hope unfolded, Simone sat on the floor of the former living room with women who had known the dull ache of eviction notices. They taught her things she had not known: how fear sometimes dulls the senses, how financial predators learn to smell desperation. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she told stories of bread and journals, and the way a steady hand can be more persuasive than a shout. Marcus, who had been her companion in steady things, began to build a life beside hers that was not a fix but a partnership. He helped run a volunteer night at Estelle's Hope and taught a small class on community organizing. He did not rush the shape of what lay between them. Love grew quietly like yeast. It rose, not as a rescue but as a steadying. There were moments of private reckoning. Simone often visited the small cemetery where Estelle lay beneath a granite marker. She would kneel and lay down the journal and speak to the air in a way that felt like prayer. The words were simple: "Thank you, help me, guide us." On one of those mornings, Marcus stood a short distance away and watched her trace Estelle's name with her finger. "She would be proud," he said. Simone smiled then, not because she needed validation, but because she recognized the truth of it. Estelle's life had been a craft of care. The woman had saved receipts and letters not to boast, but so a girl might, one day, have the tools to claim herself. Simone folded the journal closed and felt the warmth of its leather like a living history. It had taught her more than how to claim a bank's oversight. It had taught her how to be careful with power. As Estelle's Hope began to place women into stable housing and to fund small business workshops, Simone found herself invited to speak at a small conference on financial abuse. She accepted not because she sought an audience, but because she had learned that ordinary stories shared plainly can make systems pay attention. She spoke about the moment she had been taken from the gala, the emerald necklace, the camera flashes, the hollowing that humiliation brings, and about how, when truth is marshaled without malice, jurisprudence and compassion can converge. In the audience that day sat a woman who had once been quietly targeted by a different con. She came forward after Simone's talk to say simply, "You gave me a map." Simone could feel the weight of that sentence for a long time. A map. For years she had been given crumbs of certainty. Now she found that she had become a keeper of maps. Years later, when the story of the foreclosure and the reversal was told in articles that favored clarity over sensationalism, Simone read them with a slightly detached attention. The headlines had sharp angles: scandal, reversal, heir. But the paragraphs that stayed with her were not the ones that praised Theodore or indicted Darnell. They were the small lines that mentioned a foundation named for a grandmother and a house whose porch taught classes on making bread. Those were the details that mattered. The house continued to hum with activity. Children from a nearby school came through on field trips to the Foundation's community kitchen. Women in dark coats sat with counselors at a table where a pitcher of sweet tea waited. Simone sometimes caught sight of a woman who had once been at her lowest, eyes bright, steady hands, learning to balance a ledger. Such scenes gave her a deep, calm joy. On a late August afternoon that smelled of cut grass and heat, Simone walked to the cemetery with Marcus at her back. She had brought the journal, though she no longer needed it as a key. It had become a relic of a journey rather than a map she referenced daily. She knelt at Estelle's grave and laid down a small bouquet of the grandmother's favorite flowers, daisies and something with the faintest hint of lemon. Her fingers brushed the stone and traced Estelle's name. "I made something," she said aloud into the air, the words traveling like small offerings. "We made something. Not for me. For them." She looked up at the sky and felt, in the slow sweep of a cloud, both gratitude and an honest recognition of grief. The journal had held instructions, but her life had been shaped by the actions she chose each day. She had not been saved by a bank. She had been enfranchised by people who decided to turn paperwork into protection. Marcus stood beside her and rested a hand lightly on the small of her back. "She would be proud," he said again, because some truths were worth saying more than once. Simone closed the journal and slipped it under her arm. The leather had softened further with time. She felt not a hunger for recognition, but an abiding conviction that worth is not measured by names on a mortgage or the sparkle of an emerald necklace. It is measured by the hands you take when someone shoves you out of the room. The last thing she did before leaving the cemetery was to fold a small piece of paper and tuck it into the soil beside Estelle's stone. A final note of thanks. It read only, "Be a shelter." Simone left the grave with a steady step. She had been dragged from a gala and laid bare before cameras, had watched a man she had loved choose a stranger over her, had had her home taken under the guise of legal procedure. She had been quiet and then fierce. She had sought the law and used it to build protection rather than to break. She had learned that power can be a shield when wielded with care. She had built a foundation that would, for years to come, catch the women who slipped in the dark. In the evenings, when the foundation's lights dimmed, and she would walk through the rooms that kids had once used to learn how to knead dough, Simone felt, finally, an inner peace that was not born of victory but of purpose fulfilled. Love had come softly, not as a cure, but as a companion. Justice had come not as spectacle, but as careful consequence. The bank that had once issued a paper eviction sat now, in part, behind the walls of programs that would teach people to protect themselves. Theodore remained a quiet ally, a man who had used his wealth to build structures. Simone used those structures to build shelter. She never forgot the sting of humiliation. She never sought to make another human a cautionary tale. She carried the memory of the emerald necklace not as evidence of wealth but as a relic of a moment when a thing that had been taken was given back to its right owner, not to satisfy pride but to restore belonging. If someone asked her years later how she had survived the months of public exposure and private travail, she would say simply, she had learned to read the map that a grandmother had left, and then to draw one of her own. She would tell them that worth is always intrinsic, and that dignity can be defended with patience, with law, and with love. And if she could ask anything of those who listened, it was this: do not measure a life by the names on its mailboxes. Measure it by the doors it opens for others. If this story moved you, subscribe and consider supporting causes like Estelle's Hope. Small acts of care change lives.